So then, we are back with more understandings from the Renewed Covenant from the Aramaic English translation of the Word. This translation is from the original manuscripts of the Hebrews of old, from the time of the prophets of Israel, and also gives us many understandings of the completion of the spring feast found in Leviticus, and the shadow prophetic events to come based upon those understandings of Leviticus, the 23rd chapter. So then we find the Messiah, for instance, in Gospel. We find the Gospel of Mark, very interesting topic regarding then the 4th chapter. The Messiah then is speaking regarding the types of ground where then it is sown. So the Messiah previously, in the 3rd chapter, he was explaining a few areas regarding then Ruach HaKodesh. So don't read then the 3rd chapter, and then the 29th verse states then, "But he who blasphemes against Ruach HaKodesh has no then entrance in the kingdom of heaven, and is then rather guilty before the eternal judgment." So then, he was explaining then areas of Ruach HaKodesh and also his presence. So then he was explaining many areas of yet the kingdom to come government, and he was then obviously explaining to those people the second tabernacle services. And then they would be facing a period of transition, and he was explaining parts of these areas then where he was speaking with his disciples and also with the people regarding then Ruach HaKodesh, or then his presence. Then later he was then found teaching by near the sea, and gathered around him that he was, and he embarked and sat on a boat by the sea, and then he was given then understandings or parables. So then he starts speaking as the kingdom of heaven, and then he speaks of the many kind of then ground: stony ground, sandy ground, proper ground. He's speaking of the Torah, the secrets of the Torah. This is what he is speaking of. At times he used parables with a similitude regarding then investment and money. The kingdom of heaven is like such and such and such. But he was trying to say then, he was filtering the people from their own motives. If a person was then set in obedience to the Messiah, they obviously would try to understand what he was trying to say regarding the Torah. Understanding during the time when he was speaking of the Torah, the religious leaders, they did not like him. The reason why? Because he was teaching the truth, and he was cleaning the entire Torah from their own junkies. As we understand, the people of the law of his time, they used to mix the holy laws with their own junky laws, and became very extensive, and the Messiah came to clean the entire law, so then people could be obedient. But while he was doing this, then he was hated, because he was taking away their own manipulative ways of then deceiving the people. So then when the Messiah, he speaks of the situation regarding parables, he's simply making a comparison of the motives in themselves, people-wise. Then he's making a comparison with his presence and explaining the Torah. Makes a whole lot of sense, because then when you begin to read any parable that you can think of, you would find in himself filtering the people. He's not explaining the secrets as like the kingdom to come. He is then presenting a situation where then the people themselves would make a choice either to understand the Torah and receiving him as the Messiah, and then being prepared for the transitional time in the future, or they would excuse themselves, and then they would think it was some sort of a money investment, or then if you do more, you have to invest more. Then people would filter themselves out of the picture, so to speak. This is what he is saying. So then, when he was then speaking of the many parables, his main factor was he was then selecting the people to be then used later. As we understand, every time there is explanation of the secrets of the Torah, those people who are then endowed with understanding, they can relate with the Messiah as per then he explains the Torah in his presence. Obviously, those people at the early times of his ministry, those people, they were then used later. Because those people, they received the understanding of the Messiah via the Torah and its revelation, and they were used later. As we understand, his disciples, then he was involved with them most of the time. And then the people around him who were visiting with them, they also went along and they learned a lot. So during the transitional time, a whole lot more people were used because they were then continuously observing what the Messiah was explaining, and most of them were then related with the revelations of the Torah. It makes a whole lot more interesting listening from this viewpoint, because the Messiah is not expecting us to be compared with the Scripture. He expects us to understand where he's coming from. Then we have to make a decision if we want the Messiah or not. But at least we are not compared with. It's not because you don't have the ability to reach a certain level. It's because after the explanation of the revelations of the Torah, then you made a decision of not going after him. And there are many other factors regarding these parables where we can examine with more time later, because then some of them are related even with miracles. And then we begin to understand what the Messiah was doing. He was then, bit by bit, he was explaining, and there is a set of functions coming, and he was preparing his people. Please stay tuned, much more coming up.